The secret the nun couldn't hide. Sister. Catherine pressed her trembling fingers against the cold stone wall of the chapel, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps as she tried to steady the storm raging inside her chest. The rosary beads wrapped around her wrist felt heavier than chains, and the weight of her vows seemed to crush her lungs with every passing second. She had spent 15 years behind these sacred walls, 15 years of devotion and prayer, 15 years of believing. She had found her purpose in the silence and solitude of convent life. But in just 3 months, everything she thought she knew about herself, about God, about love itself, had been turned completely upside down by a pair of gentle, brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The morning Sister Maria arrived at the convent. Catherine had been tending to the garden, her hands deep in the earth, pulling weeds from around the white roses that grew along the eastern wall. She remembered looking up and seeing this new sister walking through the iron gates, carrying a single-worn suitcase, her habit slightly askew, her face flushed from the long journey. There was something different about her immediately, something that made Catherine's heart skip in a way she couldn't explain and didn't want to acknowledge. Maria had smiled at her, a soft, uncertain smile that held both hope and fear, and Catherine had felt something crack open inside her chest, something she had sealed away so long ago she had forgotten it existed. The days that followed were torture disguised as routine. Catherine found herself looking for Maria during morning prayers, her eyes drawn to the way the candlelight caught in her dark hair, the way her lips moved silently as she recited the Psalms. She volunteered to work alongside her in the kitchen, in the library, anywhere she could justify being near her without raising suspicion. They spoke of simple things at first, safe topics like the weather and the daily tasks, but gradually their conversations deepened. Maria spoke of her life before the convent, of the family that had disowned her when she chose this path, of the loneliness that had driven her to seek refuge in God's house. Catherine listened with an attention that went beyond mere compassion, hanging on every word, every pause, every slight tremor in Maria's voice that hinted at pain she was too proud to fully reveal. It was during one of their late-night conversations in the library, when they were supposed to be organizing donated books, that everything changed. Maria had been reaching for a volume on the top shelf, and Catherine had moved to help her, their hands brushing against each other in that brief moment of contact. The touch had sent electricity coursing through Catherine's entire body, and when Maria turned to look at her, their faces were just inches apart. Time seemed to stop. Catherine could see tiny flecks of gold in Maria's brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath, could hear the rapid beating of her own heart thundering in her ears, like a warning bell. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. But in that silence, in that suspended moment, everything was said. Catherine saw recognition in Maria's eyes, the same terrified, exhilarating recognition that must have been reflected in her own. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was not alone in what she was feeling. The guilt came crashing down on Catherine like a tidal wave. She spent hours on her knees in the chapel, begging God for forgiveness, begging for the strength to push these feelings away, to return to the peaceful numbness she had lived in for so long. She avoided Maria for days, switching her schedule, taking her meals alone, volunteering for every solitary task she could find. But the separation was agony. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small cell, wondering if Maria was also awake, also struggling, also trying desperately to deny what was growing between them. The pain of staying away from her was worse than any penance Catherine had ever endured, worse than the hunger of fasting, worse than the sting of the discipline. It was a hollowness that consumed her from the inside out, leaving her feeling like a shell of the person she had been. Maria found her one evening in the garden, in the same spot where they had first laid eyes on each other. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Catherine was sitting on the stone bench beneath the rose arbor, tears streaming silently down her face. Maria didn't say anything at first. She simply sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and that simple contact was enough to make Catherine's carefully constructed walls crumble completely. The words came pouring out of her then, all the fear and confusion and desperate longing she had been holding inside. She confessed that she had never felt this way about anyone, that she didn't know what it meant, that she was terrified of what it might cost them both. Maria listened without judgment, and when Catherine finally fell silent, exhausted from the weight of her confession. Maria took her hand and held it gently, her thumb tracing small circles on Catherine's palm. Maria spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, telling Catherine about her own journey, about the woman she had loved before entering the convent, about how that relationship had been discovered and condemned, about how she had fled to this place thinking she could bury that part of herself forever. She had believed her capacity for romantic love was a sin that needed to be eradicated, that by dedicating herself completely to God, she could somehow become acceptable, somehow become clean. But meeting Catherine had awakened something in her she thought had died, something that felt too pure and too right to be evil. She told Catherine that she had been avoiding the truth for weeks, trying to convince herself that what she felt was merely friendship or sisterly affection, but she couldn't lie to herself anymore. She was falling in love with Catherine, and she didn't know what to do about it. The weeks that followed were the most beautiful and the most painful of Catherine's life. She and Maria stole moments together whenever they could. Secret meetings in the library after everyone had gone to bed, walks in the garden during the early morning hours before the other sisters awoke, whispered conversations in shadowed corridors. They never crossed certain lines, never allowed themselves more than the holding of hands or the briefest of embraces, but even these small gestures felt monumental, revolutionary, dangerous. Catherine felt alive in a way she never had before. Colors seemed brighter. Prayers felt more meaningful. Even the mundane tasks of daily life were infused with a joy that bordered on euphoria. But beneath the happiness was a constant undercurrent of fear. The knowledge that what they were doing could destroy them both. That if anyone discovered the truth, they would be cast out, condemned, separated forever. The inevitable happened on a cold November night. Mother Superior had been suspicious for weeks, noticing the way Catherine and Maria looked at each other during meals, the way they always seemed to volunteer for the same duties, the unusual lightness in their steps despite the approaching winter darkness. She followed them one night and discovered them in the library, sitting close together, Catherine's head resting on Maria's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. The confrontation was brutal. Mother Superior's face was a mask of fury and disgust as she demanded they explain themselves, as she called their love an abomination and a betrayal of everything the convent stood for. Catherine tried to defend them, tried to explain that what they felt was not wrong, that it was perhaps the most genuine and pure thing she had ever experienced. But her words fell on deaf ears. They were given an ultimatum: renounce their feelings, beg forgiveness and submit to separation and penance, or leave the convent forever. Catherine spent that night in prayer, but not the desperate, pleading kind she had engaged in before. This time she prayed for clarity, for understanding, for the courage to make the right choice even if it was the hardest one. She thought about her 15 years in the convent, about the sense of purpose it had given her, about the community that had become her family. But she also thought about Maria, about the way her presence had brought light into rooms that had felt dark for so long, about how loving her had taught Catherine more about compassion and sacrifice, and the divine than any sermon ever had. She realized that her love for Maria didn't diminish her faith. It deepened it. It had taught her that God's love was bigger and more expansive than the narrow definitions she had been taught, that perhaps the divine worked through love in all its forms, not despite its diversity but because of it. When morning came, Catherine made her decision. She found Maria in the chapel, kneeling in the same pew where they had first prayed side by side months ago. Without a word, Catherine knelt beside her and took her hand. They sat there in silence for a long time, drawing strength from each other's presence, preparing themselves for what came next. Then together they stood and walked to Mother Superior's office. They told her with quiet dignity that they would not renounce their love, that they chose each other even if it meant leaving behind everything they had known. Mother Superior's expression was cold as she told them to pack their belongings and be gone by nightfall, that they were no longer welcome in God's house. The world outside the convent walls was terrifying and uncertain. Catherine and Maria left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a small amount of money they had saved from gifts over the years. They found a tiny room in a boarding house in a city 200 miles away, a place where no one knew them and no one would ask questions. The adjustment was brutal. They had to find work, learn to navigate a world that had changed significantly during their years of seclusion. and face the constant fear that someone would discover their past and judge them for it. But through it all, they had each other. They built a life together slowly, carefully, finding jobs in a small bookstore run by an elderly woman who asked no questions and seemed to understand without being told that they were running from something. Years passed, and the acute pain of losing their religious community gradually softened into a dull ache that Catherine learned to carry. She and Maria created their own rituals, their own sense of sacred space in the small apartment they eventually rented together. They lit candles on Sunday mornings and read passages from various spiritual texts, not just Christian ones, but also poetry and philosophy that spoke to the expansiveness of love and the divine. Catherine came to understand that her relationship with God had not ended. When she left the convent, it had simply transformed. She found the holy in everyday moments, in the way Maria laughed at something silly, in the quiet comfort of sitting together reading in the evening, in the gentle intimacy of caring for each other through illness and hardship. If this story has touched your heart, if it has made you think differently about love, faith, and the courage it takes to choose authenticity over acceptance, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories about real human experiences that often go untold. Every like, every share, every comment lets us know that these narratives resonate with you and gives us the strength to keep creating content that challenges perspectives and opens hearts. Catherine often thought about the other sisters they had left behind, wondering if any of them ever questioned the rigid rules that had forced two loving hearts apart, wondering if compassion had ever softened Mother Superior's judgment. She hoped that somewhere, somehow, their story might serve as a quiet testament to the power of choosing love over fear, authenticity over conformity. She and Maria never returned to religious life in any traditional sense, but they lived their values every day through kindness to strangers, through volunteer work at a local shelter, through the simple act of loving each other with integrity and devotion. Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something special. If you believe in the power of love to transcend boundaries, if you think everyone deserves the chance to live authentically, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your words create a community of understanding and support for others who might be struggling with similar challenges. 20 years after leaving the convent, Catherine received an unexpected letter. It was from Sister Anne, one of the younger nuns who had been at the convent during Catherine and Maria's final days there. The letter explained that Mother Superior had passed away, and that Sister Anne was now leading the community with a different philosophy, one focused on compassion rather than condemnation. She wrote that she had often thought of Catherine and Maria over the years, that their courage had planted a seed of questioning in her mind about the nature of love and faith. She wanted them to know that they were forgiven, that they were remembered not with shame but with respect, and that the door would always be open should they ever wish to visit. Catherine read the letter aloud to Maria through tears, and they held each other tightly, feeling a circle close that they had thought would remain open forever. They never returned to live in the convent. Their life together in the outside world was too precious, too hard-won to abandon. But they visited once, walking through the familiar gardens hand in hand, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, finally free to love each other in the light of day, beneath the same sky that had witnessed both their deepest sorrow and their most profound joy.